So as Mira said, I'm a writer, film programmer, and PhD candidate in communication and culture at Ryerson. My research centers on policing, state control, and media broadly speaking, but specifically considers the social and cultural impacts of social media police brutality videos and how artists are taking up those themes in their work. Though today we meet digitally, many of us are likely doing so from colonized lands and occupied territories. I am coming to you from Toronto and my home on a dish with one spoon territory, representative of a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land, and to which each of us are invited in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Thinking with community alongside our discussion this evening on policing, surveillance, and control. The organizers and I wish to spotlight a number of Indigenous groups and organizations to whom you can send your donations to support their ongoing resurgence, insurgence, and activism. So those are Native Women's Resource Center, Name Res, Native Men's Residence, the land defenders at the Unistoten camp who continue to resist Canada's illegal efforts to build a pipeline on Wet'suwet'en territory, which of course threatens our collective well-being. And as an additional offering, it's our understanding that they don't accept donations, but Aboriginal Legal Services does a considerable amount of work around some of the issues and themes that we'll be discussing tonight. And they share many of those resources on their website, so I encourage you to check those out. We will post links to all of these organizations in the chat, but also on the Facebook page after if you're looking for them and looking to donate. One last thing to mention before we get started. During the question period at the end of the talk, you can submit your questions to Jed in the chat. And when you're doing so, if you can just indicate in brackets whether you would like to speak your question or you would like it read, that would be great. Okay, so tonight we talk about these themes the themes of policing, surveillance, and control as they relate to the present COVID-19 pandemic. We have already witnessed how governments across Canada and the world have used this pandemic to increase police powers and intensify surveillance. Here in Ontario, police forces were given extraordinary access to a database of personal information about all residents who have tested positive for COVID-19. We have also seen a virulent criminalizing of outdoor space, targeting in particular the poor and unhoused, destroying urban campsites while demanding that folks stay home, and a fueling of carceral logics that's such as those by the City of Toronto, who targeted resources towards publicizing a way for residents to report on other people who they deemed were violating the newly established bylaws. Everything seems to be coming back to these themes of policing, surveillance, and control. So each of tonight's speakers will talk to us about their work, as well as how media and social media are shaping the social justice work, art, or critical academic thought that they engage in. What we can learn from this moment of intense regulation, what we can learn from the radical sharing, mutual aid, and community care networks that have emerged with prominence over the past few months, and what we can learn from this moment about the need for sustained support to vulnerable communities or communities most regularly subject to policing, surveillance, and control. Our first speaker is Alexander McClelland. Alex is a socio-legal researcher at Banting and a Banting postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ottawa in the Department of Criminology. He is currently examining issues of confidentiality for research with criminalized people. His work focuses on the intersections of life, law, and disease, where he has developed a range of collaborative and interdisciplinary writing, academic, activist, and artistic projects to address issues of criminalization, sexual autonomy, surveillance, drug liberation, and construction of of HIV, sorry, of knowledge on HIV. Go ahead, Alex.
Thank you so much, Nataleah. Thank you, Mira. Thank you, Ryerson. It's an honor to be here with all of you today. I'm coming to you from the traditional and still unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation, which is known as Ottawa by some people in Ontario and Canada. I'm a first-generation settler from England and a fifth-generation settler from Scotland and Ireland. I'm a longtime AIDS activist and researcher. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which Nataleah already kind of highlighted, provincial and municipal police forces have been mobilized, and federal, the RCMP, have been mobilized at an unprecedented scale up, working in concert with public health officials to enforce emergency legislation and protocols. And as someone living with HIV here in Canada, a country that is known as a world leader for criminalizing HIV, and as a social scientist who studies the policing of communicable infectious diseases, I can tell you that policing and criminalizing a virus does not work. It'll only add to the crisis. And I've seen how deputizing police in the name of public health undermines collective responses to disease. Yet, all across our country, we've seen and we've witnessed a ramp up police presence in the context of COVID. And so first, let me be clear, we must obey health guidance to protect each other, but we must also be critical of failed approaches that have no evidence of their effectiveness at combating disease. So AIDS activist and queer academic Gary Kinsman often says, when we talk about public health, we must always ask who is the public and whose health is being protected. And the new coronavirus was initially thought to be an equal opportunity virus, but that was very quickly dispelled as the pandemic's race and class dynamics became visible. Those same race and class dynamics drive the application of laws and the enforcement and policing practices aimed at attempting to control the virus. And so as a result, the public in public health will remain those who have historically never been targets of policing, while communities that have been will face the brunt of pandemic public health enforcement efforts. So policing a pandemic will only exacerbate the ways in which people have already been made marginalized in society by reinforcing existing divisions and creating new forms of stigma and discrimination. However, as we have seen, police have been positioned as central responders in the COVID-19 pandemic. I've been collaborating with my colleague Alex Lubscombe, a doctoral student at the University of Toronto, to track this unprecedented scale up of policing and enforcement with our project called Policing the Pandemic Mapping Project, or policingthepandemic.ca. And within 2 weeks of initiating the project on April 4th, based on publicly sourced media articles and police press releases and social media posts, we found over 700 incidents of COVID-19 enforcement across every province of the country. The following week, we found over 1,000. And by the end of the month, we found over 4,500 incidences of police enforcement in relation to COVID, including 30 criminal charges. A majority of the enforcements, those 4,500, were related to alleged violations of physical distancing, often were enforced with fines. And we calculated the fines to be up to 5.8 million, probably closer to 6 million now. In Ottawa, there was a report of a bylaw officer punching a Black man in his face because he refused to give his name while being asked to leave the park that had been apparently closed. The man, who was with his daughter, said the enforcement officer singled him out in a park full of others to fine him. And incidences such as this are not new. They only reflect a well-known pattern of unequal forms of pre-pandemic police enforcement. In Montreal, authorities issued now thousands of tickets, most for $1,546. And one such ticket was issued to a harm reduction outreach worker while she was supporting a street-involved people in downtown Montreal. She was handcuffed and thrown into the back of a police car for trying to provide harm reduction support to a homeless client. In the Cree community of Chisabi, Quebec, northern Quebec, 15 people were issued $1,000 tickets for home gatherings or for being alleged to disobey physical distancing rules. And in a number of instances, there were reoffenses with people facing multiple tickets after the first alleged violation. And the COVID-19 pandemic is unprecedented in our lifetime, but the merging of police power and public health is not. I myself have lived my entire adult life in a country whose laws have told me that I am considered a public health and threat and a safety issue, but I know that I and other people living with HIV are not the problem. And I can tell you that people who have symptoms of, who have been diagnosed with COVID-19, they will not be the problem either. And I often say that as someone living with HIV in Canada today, the only harm that I will encounter because of HIV has nothing to do with the virus itself. It has everything to do with the police and the criminal justice system and forms of public health surveillance that come to classify me as a risk and a threat to be controlled. And I've studied policing responses to the HIV epidemic and other communicable diseases from the early 1900s until today. And looking to the past is really helpful. It can help us to understand how to respond in the present and also look at past failed approaches. And help us understand why forms of violence imposed in the form of right suspensions, coercion, and punishment are not the answer and will only make things worse. So a really quick example, if you'll bear with me. At the end of at the end of the First World War, along with most countries in the world, Canada at the time was a relatively new settler colony, was experiencing a massive combined epidemic of sexually transmitted infections such as syphilis, herpes, and gonorrhea. And the newly formed state, the settler state at the time, did not have a public health infrastructure like we see today. Limited treatments were available for these combined diseases, and there was limited access to testing, trained professionals, or protocols. In fact, actually at the time, the whole notion of public health itself was only just emerging. But what the state did have at the time was police, courts, coercive laws, and prisons. And one of the first public health laws in Canada was enacted in 1918 at this time within the War Measures Act. And the law specifically targeted sexually active women and allowed for their coerced testing. If they tested positive for a sexually transmitted infection, they were subsequently incarcerated. At the time, leaders in public health had held really racist and eugenicist notions of aiming to maintain the racial purity of settler Canada. Whomever didn't fit into their idea of the public needed to be contained, controlled, or destroyed. And due to the limited public health infrastructure, the arrested women were held in prison during their treatment. With no effective cure at the time, treatment consisted of painful arsenic injections, and many people who were subjected to treatment in prison would go into shock or die. While sexually transmitted infections did not discriminate, this law did, and it targeted poor and working class single women and single class working women and sex workers, particularly Indigenous women, non-white immigrants, and those who are surviving on transactional sex. And so despite this law increasing the prison population across Canada amongst women, sexually transmitted infections only rose, and they did not abate until the advent of penicillin in 1928. So it wasn't until medical advances in the form of an effective antibiotic treatment that ended the combined epidemics that around the world that anything happened. It was not forms of policing or punishment that had anything to do with it. And so since its inception, this story can tell us that public health has relied on the criminal justice system to operate. And I want to complicate our idea of public health by putting that into question. So despite lip service to enforcement being the last resort to address COVID-19, in many places, policing and enforcement have been the first line of defense. And a common sanction for not following the pandemic rules includes a threat of prison. So if a person has multiple alleged gathering or physical distancing violations, the emergency public health legislation allows for a prison sentence. So all of a sudden, this story from 1918 doesn't seem so far off. The threat of prison time makes a reoffense scenario that we've seen, such as in Chisibi, Quebec, particularly troubling, revealing how public health coercion and a carceral logic unfold to become one and the same. It's a logic that quickly becomes illogical. Lock people in a crowded cage during a communicable disease pandemic for not physical distancing. That's public health policy. Yet the logic continues to do what it has always done, to target and incapacitate those who do not fit into a protected Canadian public, namely Indigenous people, Black people, other people of color, people with communicable diseases, and people who've been deemed a risk to the settler state founded on white supremacy. As another part of my research, I interviewed people from across Canada who were prosecuted for alleged HIV non-disclosure. And they were a diverse group of people, including Black and Indigenous people, gay men, women with histories of street-based sex work, and people who live in poverty. And one of the first things I found, main things I found, was that none of them had any intention to put anyone else at risk. In fact, it was the opposite. They often acted in a manner to protect their partners from potential transmission, including taking their medication regularly to render themselves infectious, or using condoms. One woman I interviewed, she handed her partner a condom prior to sex, which he did not use. Sadly, as a result of Canada's decision to use the criminal law to manage HIV, she is now a registered sex offender. She spent 3 years in jail. The law is a blunt instrument that forces complex life experiences into boxes of innocent versus guilty, but health and life are much more complex. And in a pandemic that is attacking our collective health, trying to vilify and punish individuals is not the answer. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Our next speaker is Sonia Guiñansaca. And Sonia is an international award-winning queer migrant poet, cultural organizer, and social justice activist. They emerged as a national leader in the migrant artistic and political communities where they coordinated and participated in groundbreaking civil disobedience actions. Guiñansaca co-founded some of the largest undocumented organizations in the US, including some of the first artistic projects by and for undocumented writers and artists. Sonia has worked for over a decade in both policy and cultural efforts, building equitable infrastructures for migrant artists. You can learn more about their work at soniaguiñansaca.com and on Instagram at @thesoniag. Go ahead, Sonia.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It always gets even more awkward to do it virtually now, as you're hearing. I'm Sonia Guiñansaca. I'm coming from Los Angeles, Tongva land. And before we even move into some of the things that I wanted to cover and share with you some poems at the intersection of some of the themes of tonight, I wanted to really bring into the space and ground us in what is happening, has been happening in the United States with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, with countless death that has been happening at the hands of police on Black communities, Black bodies, Black trans women. And so I want to make justice by reading one of my poems. I think I wanted to bring into the space the poem by Ross Gay, and it's called A Small Needful Fact. So, is that Eric Gardner worked for some time for the Parks and Recs Horticultural Department, which means perhaps that with his very large hands, perhaps in all likelihood, he put gently into the earth some plants which most likely, some of them, in all likelihood, continue to grow, continue to do what such plants do, like house and feed small and necessary creatures, like being pleasant to touch and smell, like converting sunlight into food, like making it easier for us to breathe. So that's a poem by Ross Gay, A Small Needful Fact. Just wanted us to hold space for that, and we can take a breather on that. It's been a long day, long week. As my bio has been mentioned, a lot of the work that I've been doing has been at the intersection of working with shifting narratives around migrant communities, undocumented communities. I myself migrated from Ecuador at the age of 5 into the United States and grew up undocumented. And for 21 years, that was my experience navigating to the United States. And a lot of my work currently as a poet, as a cultural worker, as a cultural strategist, working with different grassroots organizations and nonprofits and foundations, is focusing on the narratives that we can continue expanding when we talk about migration. Migration is not just about naming undocumented the populations, but actually it's about the work of humanizing these folks, humanizing our communities. And so invited to have this conversation about the regulation of bodies, I'm often left thinking about how this pandemic is not bringing up new issues about the regulations of certain bodies. If anything, it's just like revealing how these bodies have always been treated in this country. The regulations are particular for some communities. And so I wanted to bring into the space a poem I wrote about migrant folks, especially as we're thinking about what is essential workers and what is expandable peoples and communities, and who are these like disposable folks who are out there picking our crops, providing food for folks, packing things at Amazon. And so this is a poem I wanted to bring into the space called America Runs on Immigrants. My mother works on the 23rd floor of a glass building in the middle of Times Square as a server of a catering company. My father rides the train home from work. In his backpack, he carries a pair of Timbs with blotches of oil. Neither of them have eaten. The thing about America is that migrant workers go days without properly eating so that America can function. My mother, who goes by Maggie, will stand for 8 hours straight, bouncing on the balls of her feet to catch any demands by white professionals that for some reason know how to work a Google Drive, but have no idea how to make their own damn coffee. My father, who goes by Segundo, ironically is always first to cook, first to burn his hands, first to serve, first to deliver so that men in suits can get their lunch order. My mother and father never get days off, or paid holidays, or bonuses, or 401k, or healthcare. My mother and father depend on the power of Vicks, hot tea, and prayers to La Virgen. Sometimes my father and mother do not feel like mine. They belong to this country. My mother does not see father. My father does not see his brother. My siblings don't see mom or dad. America sees them at all times. America sees our parents more often than we do, at 4 a.m., 7 p.m., at 11 p.m., and midnight. My 9-year-old brother clasps his tiny brown hands to pray, Diosito, please take care of mom. My father carries our old school photos in his wallet, folded gently, not to crease our faces. This is how he looks after us. This is how he holds on to us. My mother carries a large purse with all of our documents because, just in case. They both accommodate Americans' routines by moving around birthdays and bautismos and weddings. America is a spoiled brat wanting more and more and more and more. America screams, go back to your country. Stop stealing our jobs. And simultaneously will whine, where is my lunch? And I hope, as a poet and cultural worker, I hope that my poems and my poetry and my collaboration with different visual artists is to uplift the intersection of, as we're talking about migrant rights, are we talking about media access, as we're talking about representation and regulations of bodies, that we're always consistently talking about the intersection of racial justice, that we're also bringing in a disability justice framework to that. Something else that I wanted to bring up is that, like my poem, America Runs on Immigrants, a lot of the invisible labor has become this like visible essential need. And a lot of the social media posts that I've engaged with online is this performative applause to essential workers without really critiquing like the need and the absence of agency from some of these folks, that they have to go out and provide, that they have to go out and package our foods, to packet our meats. And so like really thinking about, as we are thinking about essential workers, it's not by choice. Many of these folks are family members, are people within my community who are consistently fighting to, even before the pandemic, to have any type of labor rights, whether it's in farm working, whether it's in garment work. So as we're thinking about that, The other thing that I wanted to bring up is, as somebody who's from New York City and was raised in New York City, I'm always holding to heart what's happening in Rikers Island. Anytime there's a hurricane or anytime something of such pandemic is happening, the front line of folks who are used to bury or to provide some type of labor are folks who are incarcerated, people who have no input in terms of like what they're doing. And so there was this article that came out of this like aerial view of folks who are incarcerated in Rikers Island, who are burying bodies who have passed away of COVID. And so just thinking about a lot of the work that we are discussing, these are folks who are doing it on the front line. And we cannot forget how a lot of the, let me pause there. A lot of the conversations that have been brought in have been about how do we reimagine and what are we learning of this particular moment. And it's hard to imagine right now. But I do want to give props and I do want to center the work that people have been doing at the intersection of racial justice, migrant rights, disability justice, people who have been working on abolition work. And so just wanted to frame that there. And before my time is up, I did collaborate with a good friend of mine, Julio Salgado, to create a piece called "And When People Woke Up, They Were Safe." And this is after Adrienne Maree Brown, who asked us to imagine this quarantine fiction. And so just leaving you with this. And people stayed home, and people woke up, they were safe. And even though many people like janitors, cooks, street vendors, grocery workers, delivery people, nannies, electricians, construction workers, landscapers, and domestic workers still had to go to work, they were safe and appreciated. None of them feared being deported. No one dared to call them unskilled workers. They were all granted health care, amnesty, and paid above minimum wage, and had paid time off because a new policy was put in place, so no one had to choose between paying bills and staying safely home. Their bosses called them to say thank you, and when they were done with their shifts, they went home, and their family waited for them. No one stopped them on the train to harass them or blame them on the foreign virus on them. And when it was time to take a hot shower after a long day, they had running water and the lights in the bathroom turned on. And finally, for the first time in a long time, they put their feet up, undid their hair bun, ate dinner that was warm and drank chamomile tea. And when they turned the news on, it was informative. And everyone cared about other countries. And news broke out about borders coming down and people let out of detention centers and jails. And on the TV, you saw migrants welcomed into beautiful centers being met by healers, healthcare providers, and helpers who spoke multiple languages. And they were given warm clothes and fresh food from local farms. And children were reunited with their parents. And migrant children had childhoods. And everyone was given homes. No one was ever homeless in this country. Everyone relaxed and rested and loved, and everyone cared for the earth, and people stayed home. And when people woke up, they were safe. Thank you, everyone, and really appreciate the space. And again, here for the questions and the Q&A coming afterwards. And I hope the poetry illustrated some of the intersections that we're going to discuss.
Thank you, Sonia. Our next speaker is Beverly Bain. Beverly Bain is a scholar, activist, and teaches in Women and Gender Studies in the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. She currently teaches and researches in the area of the Black feminist radical tradition, Black and Caribbean diasporic sexualities, gender, feminism, and post-colonial theories, and gender, violence, and resistance. Bain is the author of Wake Work and the Coronavirus, Fire, Passion, and Politics, the creation of Blackorama as Black queer diasporic space in the Toronto Pride festivities, as well as several other articles. Bain is currently working on a series of essays on Black radical feminist queer activism in Toronto from the 80s to the present. Go ahead, Beverly. Oh, Beverly, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah, it's okay.
I always forget to turn on my mic. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nataleah, Jed, Mira, and others. Thank you to our two former speakers for their presentations. I want to actually start by actually saying that it's important for us to look at, as we start unpacking this, what is happening now in the context of COVID-19, is to start looking at what happened right at the beginning of this particular virus, in terms of the media, the mainstream media, and to look at the way in which whiteness works and how whiteness has worked through this whole entire, pandemic, how it has shaped how we actually continue to see the news, mainstream media news, and the kinds of deployment we have had to do. It is clear that what this pandemic has done is laid bare what we have already know in terms of Black lives and the afterlife of slavery, and the afterlife and the continued reality of settler colonialism. I mean, this is evident in terms of what it has laid bare. The issue around policing and surveillance is a historical practice that has impacted the lives of Black people, Black women, Indigenous communities. At the onset, it is part of the legacy of slavery, which continued and which continues, and that has become even evident. In order for whiteness to actually be preserved in this context, Black bodies and Black people and Indigenous people and racialized people have to be further policed in order, and further surveilled in order for whiteness to be preserved within this context. What has become really apparent at the onset of all of this is the fact that what we saw in terms of the media, the mainstream media, is the way that whiteness became pervasive. Blackness disappeared from the landscape. One would assume that Black people don't live here. Black people are not impacted by COVID-19. That the people that live in this country are primarily white, and they are the ones who are impacted. So they are the people who are most affected. They are also the heroes of what is happening around COVID-19. When there is a pandemic or any kind of disaster, and in this case, what has happened is that the government has been forced to spew out money in order to preserve itself, to preserve, a valued population, which is primarily white middle-class people. There's no question, and let's name it. There's also been, and what has been evident, is this crack in capitalism, and we can't talk about COVID-19 and not talk about what's happening with capital, and what capitalism is, and what capitalism is also producing, because there's an intersection here between capital, COVID-19, black race, and the ongoing legacy of slavery. And we can't separate those things. We have to actually make those connections. And the way that, settler colonialism is conjoined with all of these pieces to produce certain bodies as much more bodies that require surveillance. And I want to argue that, there's this whole perception of, of Blackness as being that which white people fear. I want to say that this is not about fear on the part of whiteness. This is also about a certain knowledge about certain bodies that can be controlled, that will be controlled, that will be managed, that will also be surveilled and will also be put in its place. So it's not about white fear. It's about a knowledge of a certain kind of treatment of certain kinds of bodies, like Black bodies, like women's bodies. And I just wanted to say something about what Alex said in terms of, his piece on public, public health. In fact, this whole premise on public health started with Africville in the 1800s. You know, I mean, this whole device around creating Africville and allowing it to deteriorate and destroying it by building numerous disposable various kinds of disposable containment around it was a way to actually shape that community as a public health risk, and therefore shape it as a public health risk, which means it had to be destroyed, which means it had to be disposed of. So this thing about public health has always been an issue for Black bodies, because Black bodies have been constructed as wayward bodies, according to Saidiya Hartman. And therefore these bodies have to be managed and controlled in public spaces. So what we have recognized and what we are seeing right now in terms of the policing of Black people, and we're seeing it constantly in terms of, in terms of Black people being charged, Black people being corralled, like downtown Toronto, Black people being slapped down, Black people being ticketed, white people calling Black people for occupying spaces that actually, where these spaces are actually empty. Black people with their families walking in spaces or in parks where no one else are actually being ticketed, are being arrested, are being violated. So we see how Black bodies and Black bodies in particular spaces are considered, those bodies are considered open for surveillance and for actual ongoing brutalization in the context of what we are seeing as a pandemic. So what we are seeing now is a continuation of what has already been happening. It's not new, it's just ramped up, but it's also revealing, right? It's also revealing as to who actually matter in this context. When we look at what's happening in Montreal, Black women who are Haitians are actually now at the front line in hospitals, who don't have, who are actually women without status, but they are the front line being infected and being killed by COVID-19. And we have a government who refuses to come forward and say, yes, these people have a right to stay in this country. Even though these are people whose claims, some of them were turned down, some of these claims are still on the books, and our government refuses to take a stand, which means it's a clear indication of the valuing of certain bodies and what kinds of bodies are available to die and what kinds of bodies are available to live. And what's very clear is that Black bodies, like Indigenous bodies and other racialized bodies, because again, racialized women are at the front line of the pandemic. These are the women who are getting up early in the morning and taking the subway and the buses at 4 in the morning to get to these places so that they can be the protecting line against us, primarily those who are privileged enough to have homes and be able to stay in those homes, and the virus itself. But these are not the people that you are seeing in the mainstream media. These are not the people you are seeing whose lives are at risk, right? These are not the voices you are hearing, but you're hearing and you're seeing Black people corralled and Black people arrested and Black people's lives put in jeopardy. And what has happened in the US just recently, in terms of, the murder, the blatant, violent, excruciating, murder of George Floyd, by this police officer is, part and parcel of what is a continuation and what is allowed to happen in this context under COVID-19, even more so. It reveals it, but it also still excuses it. Because look at Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper, right? Amy Cooper, who felt very privileged to call the cops because this man told her to put the dog on a leash, right? A Black man tells her to put a dog in a leash. In the park where the 5, young men who were actually accused of rape, in that same park, within that same region. And I think people need to see those connections in terms of how the pandemic is revealing all of these things, but it is also positioning it in some way as if it's new, but it isn't. It's a continuation of a historical practice that has actually become even far more revealing in this context. And I think it's really critical for us to start thinking about how we use social media and what we use it for, and thinking about alternative social media, creating alternative social platforms in order to be able to actually create organizing in ways that begin to intervene in some of these narratives and discourses, and to actually start talking about the way in which whiteness and anti-Black racism and, you know, settler colonialism and, you know, ongoing racialization continues to meet at this juncture and continue to produce, you know, certain lives as at the, you know, a juncture of death, and others more livable. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly.